May 4, 1989, a million flashing lights, tires screeching, yelling and hollering, and above it all, freeze, don't move, jerkweed. I froze, and not just my body, my entire being went completely primordial. I couldn't even breathe right. My brain seemed to have 3 levels: disbelief it wasn't really happening, an acute awareness of what was going on around me, completely frozen. Weapons were actually pointed at me. I'd never realized that when a loaded handgun looks at you, the barrel seems about the size of a sewer pipe. My first instinct was to raise my hands in the air, but I would have fallen over and tumbled off the wing. Jerkweed, the guy had yelled out. I hadn't heard that since Die Hard.
The voice you just heard is that of a prolific drug smuggling pilot reading the opening passages of Chapter 1 of his book. In the moment he recalls, his Cherokee 6 had just been surrounded by men with guns drawn, after he landed with enough cocaine on board to put him away forever. But for him, that's where his story takes a most fortunate turn, because this marijuana and cocaine smuggling pilot is one of just a few to have gotten away. Stay tuned for this episode of Fly By Night. George Williams, and by the way, that isn't his real name, published his book Snow on the Palms in 2012. In the book, he felt free to share his extensive history of running drugs from the Bahamas and Colombia into South Florida. By then, the timing had run out for any crime for which he could have been charged. Now, it should be noted that the stories he shares he tells under his assumed name, and that makes them hard to verify. But with that said, it doesn't take a lot of research to verify key details of his life as George Williams. And as best as can be determined, his knowledge of locations, times, and known facts match well with the record. Returning to why he has felt free to share his story, one crucial aspect is that all of George Williams' crimes have been nonviolent crimes. But that doesn't mean they've been small. He may have had a small plane, but his Piper Cherokee 6 was more than capable of runs to the Bahamas for hundreds of pounds of marijuana in the beginning, and then later, making longer flights to Medellin, Colombia, to bring back millions of dollars of cocaine. During that time, Williams says he was nothing special in the heyday of drugs being flown into Florida. He was just one of many enterprising pilots up for an adventure that came with a big payday. But there was something that did set him apart from his fellow smugglers. Early on, when he departed for the Bahamas and returned with a load of Colombian red, he would often pass over his parents' home on the shore. That's the shore that's comprised of some of the most expensive real estate in the country, Palm Beach. George Williams was that rare flyer, a rich kid who was now running drugs. As detailed in Snow on the Palms, Williams has had an eclectic life. His inventor father did well enough for the family to purchase a home on Palm Beach, and with his own talent as a recording and performing rock musician, Williams had his own income. So as a student pilot, he had the resources to buy his own plane when most new pilots can only dream of such a luxury.
I would drive past an airport that had a little sandwich board sign that said, "Ride, $5." And that got to me after a while. So I stopped in, and this was in 1972. I stopped in and, I wanted a $5 ride. And they're very clever. The guy says, okay, and he starts explaining things to me, which I didn't, why is he explaining this? I just want to ride. And, of course, we go up, and he's saying, grab the wheel, do this, do that. By the time I get down, he says, well, now you're going to need a logbook and this and that. And I said, yeah, sure. So I was hooked, right away. And that was a Cessna 150, which was like ridiculous because the two of us weighed about as much as that thing could carry. I made a deal with the instructor, a guy named Pete, right away. I said, we can't fit in this 150. I said, how about if I buy a plane? You can use it whenever you want, but you give me lessons for free. So he liked the idea. So that's what we did. And I bought a Cherokee 180, a 1968 Cherokee 180D, and it worked fine. He used it sometimes, which was great, and then I got the lessons for free. So I wound up, getting my private, I guess in 73.
With his father celebrating his success with the purchase of a Palm Beach mansion and enticing his son to come with him to join in a new venture, Williams packed up his plane and headed south. Not long after he arrived, a chance meeting at his local airport would change George Williams' life as a pilot.
Actually, our whole family kind of moved down at once, meaning my brothers and I and my dad, because he'd been an inventor. And he sold one of his inventions to Johnson & Johnson, and he decided to move to Palm Beach. So he did, and he said, "You guys want to move with me? We'll start another company." That sounded pretty good. So we all did. I was moving to the area, and of course I took my plane. I looked on a map, and there were 3 airports that I could base myself at that were in the area, but the closest was Gardens. It was a real small strip. So I landed there in 73. I think I flew to the Bahamas one time, and I flew around the area, and then one day Lee approached me, and he said, "Hey, nice plane." We got to talking. So they asked me, did I want to, participate in this stuff? And they said, I didn't know much of anything about it. They said, it's just offshore here. You don't have to do much of anything. And they said, there's no risk. Depending on where you land, the cops will help you unload. What? So that's kind of, okay, well, what's it pay? And, when they said, the money, which I believe at that time was $100,000 for a load of Colombian red, because my plane helped quite a lot for a single engine aircraft, and what, $100,000 for an afternoon flight? No risk? I didn't really believe the no risk part, but heck, I'm in.
It was wide open. That has to be one of the most commonly used phrases in conversations with those who flew drugs into South Florida in the early to mid-'70s. And the other thing they often say, that it wasn't simply for the money. It was the thrill of living a double life, of getting away with what others were too timid to try.
It was like a spirit of adventure. I mean, it was almost like, a soldier going to war or a guy going on a big adventure. I mean, there was no... to be honest, there was no moral quality to it. There was no like, what am I doing? This is illegal. It was like, whoa, it might as well have been flour. It was just a load of stuff you get a lot of money for, and these guys are doing it, and it's a beautiful flight out there, and it's not far. Yeah, let's go. That's about all the thinking, really, there was to it. And I think that's all the thinking of any of us that did it.
Listening to Williams, it doesn't seem like it took a lot of convincing to move him from well-to-do pilot to risk-taking smuggler. His new friends made it sound so easy, and his first trips did nothing to dispel their claims.
Well, I left Gardens Airport and flew low. I didn't know if there was any radar coverage or anything, but I flew low. I actually went over my parents' house on the ocean and headed straight out to New Bight. It was easy to find, and once I got offshore, I gained a little altitude because I was worried about pelicans. You get hit by a pelican, you're going down. So I didn't want to get hit by anything. So I got up to, I don't know if I got to 1,000. I might have gotten to 1,000, but that was to be the most. And then just headed up to New Bight. It was, like I say, easy to spot. And they loaded me up, and I supervised them because this plane would take cargo both in the rear and the front, so you had to make sure it balanced out, So we did that, and then flew back, and what I was advised to do, which is stay real low, and come up and join the pattern at Gardens, like you just took off from that airport and just went around and flew a pattern or two. So my parents' house, again, was exactly in along that path. And I think that was a trip that my dad wound up, he was out on the lawn and they saw me and he took my picture, which was really funny. But I landed there, and then over time, the other guys landed because it was staggered. Nobody, you weren't going to land as a fleet, right? That would be noticed. And everybody went down and had a meal, and then they unloaded it that night. And there wasn't a lot of lighting at that airport, so the cars and stuff lit up the field so they could load the stuff, which didn't take very long. And the guys that loaded turned out to be Colombian nationals. I mean, they were obviously not Americans. And then they left. And it was clever how they loaded it, because some of them were on trailers of cars or trucks, like they were taking, transporting automobiles and vans, and they put the stuff in one case, it looked like a milk truck, and they got a lot of stuff in that. And then they were gone, and they left a bag of cash.
Colombia. It's impossible to talk about the history of smuggling by air into the U.S. without talking about the outsized influence of this country on the northern edge of South America. With its rich heritage and history hijacked in popular culture by those who flooded the United States with drugs in the 70s and 80s, for a time Colombia's name became shorthand for contraband that spread throughout the United States. And when that contraband shifted from pot to coke, it more often than not arrived on board a plane that passed through Florida. In the vast airspace that sits over the United States, there are a few areas where the number of aircraft in the skies at a given time is stunning. And that's always been the case in South Florida. During the busiest years of smuggling by air, the thousands of legitimate flights provided cover for the many planes that were hauling illicit cargo from the islands, and increasingly from Central America and Colombia. And it was at airstrips on the arid northern shores of Colombia and the lush valleys to the south that planes were packed to their fuselage walls with the drug that, pound for pound, changed the economics of smuggling from the days when the majority of cargo was marijuana. When drug production in Colombia turned hard towards cocaine, pilots who had thought they were becoming rich by bringing in pot now realized that great wealth was possible if they were willing to take the risk. When faced with that decision, many refused, but not George Williams. Though aware of the potential danger involved with failing to deliver the millions of dollars of cocaine he would be entrusted with, he looked at it as a businessman would, and easily made the switch from hauling pot to coke.
The market changed, and so it got to be that the Colombians, in particular, started replacing their crop of marijuana with the cocaine. And so it wasn't so much a conscious decision by us pilots to switch from one to the other as it was that's what the market was doing. It was just one more step from a quick hop to the Bahamas to flying down to Colombia. I mean, it was a long step. It was far. Basically, it was the same sort of people. There were other groups doing it, of course, besides us, as I'm sure you know because of your podcasts. A lot of different groups doing it. I didn't really have very much interaction with any of the people down in Medellin, except when I can't remember why I had to. I know I was trying to negotiate a better price. That's when I met Escobar and his henchmen like Rafa. And I would meet them sometimes when I would go and pick up a load, some of these people. But the time I met Escobar, I was at his ranch to try to negotiate another deal. Well, I would say he was larger than life, and at least that was my impression of him. He didn't really speak English, so there was if he did, he didn't do it when I was there. So there was some other people, translating. But he felt, I think, an affinity for pilots because he flew himself. His first airplane was up on the entrance to his ranch. So he kind of he was an affable kind of guy, I thought, which I knew he really wasn't in a lot of his dealings, but for me he was.
A Piper Cherokee 6 like Williams owned is considered a very capable load-hauling single-engine plane. But even with larger fuel tanks providing an impressive range, the 6 still needed a conveniently located fuel stop to and from the airfields of Columbia. George Williams found that stop in a long dirt strip along the coast of Honduras.
Well, there really wasn't a lot of choice if you wanted to, if you needed to refuel. It's not like I picked Puerto Lempira over a bunch of other places. That was about the best place that was on the coast, so it wasn't too far out of the way and was about halfway, and there really wasn't much around it. So it was sort of a natural choice. I didn't pick it because of any other reason than, oh, good, this is about where I need to be.
The flight from Puerto Lempira, Honduras to Medellin, Colombia was pretty straightforward for Williams. Though far easier now with GPS, it wasn't hard to fly heading from Honduras to the north shore of Colombia before following a highway and recognizable landmarks to one of the airports used by Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel.
And I believe I had a bearing on the big airport and then taking a left turn. But then you just take a left turn and follow the highway, and that was pretty much the way to do it.
If your knowledge of what it took to fly loads of drugs into the United States only came from watching films like American Made or Blow, you'd think that every smuggling flight was filled with danger. And it is true that planes and pilots disappeared on those flights for a variety of reasons, including flying old, worn-out aircraft, or overloaded planes that couldn't make it off a short runway on a hot day, or encountering bad weather going to and from South America. George Williams has few such stories of escape from danger to tell. The closest he came to an end that would have left family and friends wondering what had happened to him was a classic near collision that came about as he needed a lower altitude to keep him out of the clouds and below radar.
The one that was the most memorable was when I made a bad decision to try to get home from Puerto Lempira when the weather was going really bad, going south. It was because I just had a social engagement. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but I got to get back for that. Not a smart decision. So it was overcast, and it got worse and worse. And that was the time when I suddenly came out of the fog, and there was a helicopter rescuing some people on a boat that had apparently capsized. And I came within, 50 feet, 100 feet of the guy. And it was over before you realized it, but we both looked at each other in horror. That was pretty scary. But most of them weren't that memorable. They were just beautiful flights, nice weather, go down there, have a taco, refuel, load, go.
Along with his large-scale transportation of the Medellin cartel's cocaine, there came a time when Williams took on the role of middleman in a small-scale but lucrative retail operation to satisfy the desire for coke by some of the well-to-do citizens of Palm Beach. And it began innocently enough with renting his garage apartment to a stranger.
In Palm Beach, a lot of the houses are older and they have detached garages. And mine did as well, with an apartment over it. And it was my intention when I moved in there to use it as a music studio. But I never did get around to lugging the stuff up these narrow stairs to set up the studio. One day the doorbell rang, and it was this very aristocratic-looking guy who was a Middle Eastern kind of guy, looked like a young Omar Sharif, dressed immaculately. He knew I had a garage apartment and was it available, which I hadn't really thought about until that point. I'm not really going to turn this into a studio. So he really wanted to see it. So we went up and he saw it, and I decided that, yeah, sure, you could have it. He seemed like a nice enough guy. So I rented it to him and he moved in. Turned out he was an architect and he worked in Palm Beach. So we got to be kind of friends. That's how I got to know Hector. We got to talking about stuff, and he knew everybody in Palm Beach. I don't know really quite how, but he did. we got to talk, and he mentioned that, gosh, he knew he could move a lot of this stuff. And I had been to a couple of events where, and there were always lawyers were asking me, hey, you know where we can get some blow? This, wow, might be a market. So Hector said, I can move this stuff. I said, okay, look, might be a risk, but if you want to do the whole thing yourself, have at it. And I managed to get him a small supply, and no matter how much I got him, he sold it.
In what first appeared to be the bad luck of bad timing, on a run that had Williams stopping at Puerto Lempira for fuel on the way back to Florida, he got out of his fully loaded plane at the dusty airport to find some other planes parked there, with their pilots and passengers pretending to be there to fish. But instead of fishing gear, they brought guns. Remember how this episode opened, with George Williams and his plane loaded with coke, surrounded by cops with their guns drawn? In his book, he tells how he was able to walk away that day with the help of a government agent he first met at Puerto Lempira. Here, he describes that meeting and the unusual and very beneficial partnership that developed.
Well, I was making my usual stop back at Puerto Lempira one time, so the plane was full of goods. When I landed, there were several other aircraft there that were not normally at Puerto Lempira. And I asked the local guy, I said, well, what's this? And he said, well, they say they're here to fish. It didn't seem right. And did they have a lot of fishing equipment? No, but they had guns and they had radios. And okay. So I said, this could be tricky. Maybe I better just have a sandwich and get out of here, But I wound up spending the night, and I met one of them. And he asked me what I was doing there, and I said I was a medical missionary, which was a story I had concocted long before in case I ever had to use it. I was going to, I forgot what country, to deliver medical goods. And he said, oh, yeah, we're here for the fishing. And so that was the end, except that they had gotten into the plane overnight. And I could tell because, and they had peeled back the tape on the end number, so they knew who I really was. Oh, wow, I didn't need that. But then they contacted me a couple of weeks later, and they said, would you be interested in flying these medical goods that you fly now for us? Which kind of like, what? So that's, they initiated the contact, and they explained that they no longer had their little Air Force, Southern Air Transport, and that they could use these goods and a number of operations that they ran. And but they couldn't really get them themselves. And so, okay. So my main interest in doing so was not the money, because they weren't going to pay very much, but for protection. And so that's why we came to that arrangement. And I would fly the occasional load for those guys. And their loads were usually smaller and sort of irregular. They were, with the cartel. I mean, there was somebody counting everything, and how keeping their eye on everything. These guys were, load this, load that, and they loaded it in plain sight, which was horrifying. Well, they wanted to go to the Naval Air Station in Key West, which was nuts. I said, no, we can't do that. So I think we went to Tamiami, just south of Miami, and landed there. And then they just drove up in a van and loaded a van in broad daylight. And I was like, what? This isn't, I guess they didn't care,
As many trips as he flew, and as much money as he made and kept, George Williams doesn't consider himself one of South Florida's big-time smuggling pilots, just one of the many that use their piloting skills in the criminal trade of importing prohibited substances. But another thing that did set him apart from any of his fellow smuggling pilots was how he chose to launder his money, and he's written a book about that as well.
I didn't want to leave the impression in the book that I was like the main guy doing this or the sole person. There was a lot of groups running this stuff. They were looking at $60 million a day of stuff. And so I was just a small cog in a big wheel. Sometimes it'd be a double trip. and that's where you really made the money, because if you brought the money down, well, let me put it this way: if the plane would hold $44 million cash in $100 bills. It had no seats behind me, so I could, every square inch and every pound that I could get, it would hold 44 million, or the equivalent of 18 bales of marijuana, or 440 kilos. So it was like all those three loads, and it was a physical operation. They had to bring the money down. So people and this was a small group of couriers, because I mean the trust element is really the key here. To load your plane up with 44 million bucks and show up, you got to be able to trust those guys. Of course, they had ways of making sure that you did. So if you were timing it right, you could bring a load down to Medellin and then fly up to around Santa Marta and load up. So you made the same amount of money each way, a little over 1.3 million. So, a couple of day trip was 2.6 million. So you didn't need to take that many trips. At first, this cash you'd stuffed it in your bedroom closet and had no idea what to do with it. I had to come up with a plan. And so I had already been playing blackjack for years. So the trick was to launder it in Las Vegas. I set it up so that, I would be a visible gambler in Vegas, which is something that card counter, usually that's the last thing they want to do. But it was the first thing I wanted to do, because I wanted to, get my reputation for being a heavy card player in that town. And then I would wash the money through Vegas. I would bring it out there, and then I established an account in the Valley Bank. And that was ostensibly my gambling winnings that were going in, when really I just brought it out and stuck it in. And I would still play, but not for that kind of money. I ran into a guy who was a computer IT person. And now we're going back to the 1980s, so it was pretty rudimentary. And he had been barred in Las Vegas for counting cards. And I didn't know if I believed this story, but he said, "No, I'll show you." And he brought in a book written by a guy named Lawrence Revere, a math professor, to show how you could actually beat the game. And I got kind of interested in it, and I started doing it at home, dealing the cards and doing the bets and seeing if it really worked. And it worked. So once I had theoretically been able to count cards and beat blackjack, I said, "Oh boy, I'm heading out there. I'm going to clean that town out." And I got wiped out right away. Because what I didn't realize is that these guys have seen card counters before, and they have defenses, and I wasn't really focusing on that. I was just there to play. And it took about 3 trips before I could actually start to win. And then I was, the operation ran pretty smoothly after that. I'd go into the Valley Bank and talk to the VPs. "Yeah, I had a good week at the table." And they'd put in a bunch of cash. And so it covered that. And I always paid taxes, which was something nobody did.
To describe the life he left behind so many years ago, George Williams turns to a quote by a Baseball Hall of Famer who reflected on his time in the major leagues.
Well, I think the best way to describe the time I spent running the drugs and stuff was best expressed by Mickey Mantle, the Yankee ball player. When he was asked about his career, he said, "It's like it happened to another guy." And in a way, that's sort of true. It's like, that or the blackjack or whatever. It's like, yeah, okay, it happened, but it's sort of like surreal now. It was, hard to explain. I don't have any moral judgment on it, but it was like it happened almost to another guy.
George Williams continues to live and fly in South Florida, with flights for fun to the Keys or out west. And according to him, they're all normal, mundane, and very legal flights. You can find a detailed account of his life in Snow on the Palms, available on Amazon. Thanks for listening to this episode of Fly By Night. Fly By Night is brought to you by Midnight Flyer Media. Theme music is Darker by Henrik Anderson, with sound design and original music by Abe Stites. Show art is by Einie, with additional design by Abe Stites. The show is produced, hosted, and edited by Charles Stites. If you like what you hear, please leave a rating and a review, and subscribe to Fly By Night wherever you get your podcasts. And for photos and more on the key players in each episode, visit flybynightpodcast.com.